Hello and welcome to the conversations around Hindu spirituality and psychotherapy. My name is Shivam Gosai, and I'm here to introduce you to our guest today. Our guest is Dr. Lionel Corbett. He is trained in medicine and psychiatry in England and as a Jungian analyst at the C.G. Jung Institute in Chicago. Dr. Corbett is a professor of depth psychology at the Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara, California, where I study as well, and he teaches depth psychology. His primary interests are the religious function of the psyche, especially the way in which the personal religious experience is relevant to individual psychology, the development of psychotherapy as a spiritual practice, and the interface of Jungian psychology and contemporary psychoanalytic thought. He is the author of numerous professional papers and books, amongst which are Psyche and the Sacred, The Religious Function of the Psyche, Psychotherapy as a Spiritual Practice, and so on. Dr. Corbett also happens to be very interested, and he is a student of Vedanta, and he's very interested in the intersection between Vedanta and psychotherapy. And so I'm very excited to have him on today. Very good. Thank you.
You were asking about why psychotherapy might be of value to practitioners of Vedanta.
Yeah.
And various responses come to mind. One is that no matter how spiritually evolved an individual is, that doesn't mean that they don't have areas of the personality like shadow material or personal complex material, which can make them uncomfortable, cause some emotional distress. So you can make the personality more comfortable with psychotherapy. And I've met lots of people with fairly high levels of spiritual attainment who needed psychological work.
Okay.
You don't get rid of your personality, do you? If you're
I suppose not.
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's true that if you could be fully realized, then that would be the ultimate medicine. If you knew your identity with the Atman and so on. But other than that, unless you're at that level, you can't really wave it all away, I think, your personality.
In a more fundamental way, would you say that that's the goal of psychotherapy, to make you more comfortable with your personality?
It's one of the goals. Of course, it depends on the school of thought, but if I just take Jung's point of view, he thinks that the personality has a kind of destiny, really, a telos, a goal that it's aiming towards, and that it's very important for the individual to live out that destiny. Many Jungians think that's what the self, the capital S self, requires of us, so that it can carry out its experiment. It's really using us as research subjects. I wonder what would happen if we did,
Yeah, so to reach some sort of potential that we all have.
Yeah, but yes, that's right. And the potential is given to you, from Jung's point of view. You could look at it in terms of samskaras, karmic endowments in the soul that have to be experienced. So from that point of view, the ego doesn't have any choice. There are certain things that have to be lived out. That would be part of your destiny.
Seems very in line with the idea of karma.
Yeah, I think it is, yeah. Well, that's what I was trying to link the two traditions, in that way. Anyway, so the point is, if that's the case, then you may as well do it consciously. You may as well realize what you're doing and participate consciously in the process,
What about psychotherapy makes that possible, to make this process more conscious?
Well, Jung's idea was that individuation would happen anyway, whether you were conscious of the process or not.
Interesting.
But that somehow if you pay attention to the unconscious, to the manifestations of the unconscious and to the self, and then you are participating in what is really a transpersonal process. You remember, he thought that when I use the word self in this context, I mean the biggest self. We can discuss whether that's the same Atman or not in a minute. But he thought that the self, it's as if the self has given you a task, you know, and you can participate in living it out. And he thought that the self is incarnating itself. As you become more and more conscious of the manifestations of the unconscious in dreams and synchronistic events and things like that, every time you become more and more conscious of what the self is, of the way the self is manifesting itself, it's that process of increasing consciousness of the self is like a process of incarnation or embodiment.
Yeah.
And there are Jungians like Edinger who, based on some of Jung's writing, who think that you are then assisting the divine in the differentiation of its own consciousness. You know, that it wants to realize the opposites within its own nature. It can only do that by living them out within a human consciousness. It's a bit controversial, but that's what he thought. So you know, it's as if you're doing it. You're helping in that process. So that makes it not just a secular pursuit, you see.
Yeah. It feels very similar to like karma yoga, where you're living out what the spiritual, the divinity that's within you. You're living that out, and yeah, playing your role in the universe.
Yeah, if you accept the fact that, you know, each individual has their own dharma to live out. And, you know, that really contravenes traditional developmental psychology, because they would say that, you know, your personality is the result of your genes interacting with your environment.
Yeah. Right.
So what Jung is, by adding this this aspect of living out what the self is giving you to live, and that's a whole other dimension of this.
Makes it spiritual.
Makes it spiritual, and it marginalizes Jungians. It makes them unwelcome in the academy. Yes. But who cares?
And so either you can go against that will, or you can go along with that will. I suppose that going along with that is more of a pleasurable experience as a human.
Go against it. If you try and go against it, you just get dragged kicking and screaming. Jung's definition of free will is doing willingly what you have to do anyway. I mean, you know, I don't know, how would you go against it? I mean,
I suppose I meant going unconsciously.
Going unconsciously, yeah. Well, then what happens is you, according to Jung, you meet the unconscious comes at you on the outside. The major events of your life, things that seem to be coming at you from the outside, are really the unconscious, meeting the unconscious. So I don't think you can really avoid it. Either you do it internally or externally. But how would you relate that to Vedanta? I mean, you're not, in using that method, you're not realizing the self through meditation or through self-inquiry, through Atma-vichara. You're doing it through work with dreams and, you know, those kind of things. So it's a different approach. And I think the goals are different, and I don't think the results are the same. Some people think they are, I don't think so. I think you can be quite far along in the individuation process and not be realized in the Advaitic sense.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think the opposite is true. But
Right. Could you speak more about those similarities and differences, about the individuation process and the self-knowledge pursuit?
well, Jung wanted to maintain a distinction between the ego and the self. He had the idea, which I think is wrong, but his idea was that if you lose the self completely, you know, in practices like samadhi or whatever practice you do, where the ego is, you know, just a drop of water lost in a big cup of wine, it's just gone. And then he thought that was equivalent to unconsciousness. So he wasn't in favor of that kind of practice. Whereas in several Eastern traditions, to lose the ego in that way is a high level of attainment. He would say, no, you're unconscious. There has to be at least some residual ego. That's otherwise, for example, you wouldn't have a memory of the experience. So he's not in favor of sort of a complete loss of ego. So he thinks, his phrases, he thinks that Eastern intuition has overreached itself. So that's an important difference. So he never fully espouses a fully non-dual approach. He wants to maintain the importance of some ego consciousness.
The ego must always remain.
Yeah, yes. He's worried about inflation. If you identify with the self completely, he's worried about inflation or that you would ignore shadow material, you know, because you would think you were above it, or, you know, that kind of thing. But you know, you can do both. You can work as you can do a meditation and you can work on dreams. I mean, they're not incompatible.
Yeah, I suppose that's what's occurring to me right now, that a Vedanta student may not even know what the unconscious is.
Well, because from a sort of traditional, shall we say, Upanishadic point of view, if consciousness is the totality, capital C consciousness cannot be unconscious of itself. That wouldn't make sense. The sun doesn't need light to make it shine. I mean, it is, consciousness cannot be unconscious of itself.
It's self-evident.
I think that was a mistake that Jung made in his answer to Job, where he thought that the self could be partly unconscious of itself. I don't know if you want me to discuss that, but I think that was a mistake that he made. But so from the point of view of the larger consciousness, there is no unconscious.
Right.
There's only there is an unconscious from the ego's point of view, but that's just the tip of a very large iceberg.
I mean, just for, I'm wondering if you could just give a quick definition of like what even the unconscious is, or how you would introduce the unconscious to someone.
Well, there are two levels of the unconscious from Jung's point of view. There is material. If you can imagine an iceberg, so the tip of it would be what we call ego consciousness, or the everyday empirical awareness that we all have. And then, as it were, in this, it's not a perfect metaphor, but as it were, below that, there's material from childhood which is repressed, which means pushed out of awareness because it was so painful or traumatic or unmanageable that we have to not remember it actively. That's called, so that's the repressed material from childhood that the Freudian tradition has emphasized. Jung thought there was a level below that, which is a transpersonal level of the unconscious, which is the level from which mythic imagery, religious imagery arises. And when you're in touch with that level, you're in touch with, you have a sacred or experience or a religious experience. And really only he deals with that level. That's the level, the archetypal level of the psyche.
There's a level of psyche that's transpersonal that we're all connected to.
We all participate in it. And that's what distinguishes his psychology from other schools of thought. So is that any help?
Yeah, that's helpful.
Okay.
And so the idea is, as you were saying, to be, I guess, to if I can say, tap into that collective unconscious, yeah, and become more aware of whatever is arising from that layer.
Yeah. And he thought that was the level from which religious experience arises.
Mm-hmm. 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 And so you were saying that process can make someone more comfortable with their personality. I guess, could you make that connection? At the beginning, we were saying that psychotherapy can make someone more comfortable with their personality. Yeah. I guess, what's the connection between connecting with the unconscious and being more comfortable with their personality?
Well, because you might be, let's say, just anxious or depressed for no obvious reason. Mm-hmm. You may just feel unhappy, unfulfilled. You may have very low self-esteem. I'm no good. I'm a worthless person. Nobody loves me. Those kind of very painful feelings. Mm-hmm. And you may not know why. There are many people who are very pleasant, attractive, intelligent people who think that they are worthless.
Right.
Nobody cares about them, and they feel unlovable. And if you ask them, how could you feel that way? They don't know why. And the reason for that is, in a way, locked in the unconscious. Mm. So if you can release that and re-experience it with a therapist, you can change those kinds of feelings. That's what I mean by making them more comfortable.
Okay.
Okay.
That's helpful.
So I guess we'd have to discuss a little bit the notion of the self in Vedanta and Jung, because there's some controversy about this. Because the Vedantic tradition doesn't talk about the self the way Jung does. There's some overlap. Jung realizes that his notion of the self, which in the English language literature is usually written with a capital letter S to distinguish it from the personal self, yourself, myself.
The personality.
Yeah, the ordinary personality, yeah. Mm-hmm. Jung realizes that has a transcendent background or source. Okay, so, but he thinks it produces imagery, like dream imagery. Okay, the self is the maker of dreams, and that the self is a kind of spiritual director in the personality, which is moving the personality in a particular direction. But the Vedantic notion of the Atman doesn't attribute those kind of properties to it. It doesn't say that it's the self that's making you have amazing dreams and things like that. In fact, in the Vedantic tradition, as far as I can tell, there are some theories about dreams, but they think it's a rather inferior level of consciousness.
Yeah, just projections from the waking experience. The memories stored from the waking experience are just being replayed in some way.
Yeah, and the waking experience is more important, I think, than dreams in Vedanta, yeah, which Jung would not agree with. He thinks dreams are extremely important. Jung thinks that his notion of the self is the same as the Vedantic Atman or the Purusha, you know, Patanjali and so on. Other people, some people have denied that because of Jung's notion that the self could partly be unconscious of itself. And people have pointed out that if the self is the totality of consciousness, it doesn't make any sense to say it can be unconscious of itself.
Meaning that it can't be, so for Jung, the self is not aware of its totality. Is that what that means?
The origin of this was in his book on Answer to Job, where he said that he's talking about the biblical Yahweh, but for him that's simply an image of the self. It doesn't realize how it's making Job, the biblical Job, suffer, because it doesn't realize that it has a dark side that causes evil and suffering. And only when Job maintains his integrity and insists on his innocence does that force the self to become conscious of its own dark side. So that essentially Jung's idea is that the self uses the human ego consciousness to act as a reflecting consciousness for the opposites like good and evil within its own nature, which it's not aware of, because in the self they're undifferentiated. The self is the totality. They only differentiate themselves within a human consciousness, the original one being Job in the biblical story. So therefore there's this level of the self which is unconscious of itself. And that's, so people have said, well, then that can't be the same as the Atman or the Purusha, you know. And I think myself, I don't know, I think I might be in the minority opinion. I think I just made a mistake about that.
Okay, interesting.
You know, I agree. I don't think the self can be unconscious. If the self is the totality, Jung also says that the self is the totality of consciousness and the unconscious.
Right.
If it's a totality, how can it be unconscious of itself? It just,
right.
Anyway, so
that makes sense.
Jung talks about the self as producing very powerful religious experiences. The examples would be Moses at the burning bush, or Saul on the road to Damascus in the Bible. These would be contact with that transpersonal layer of the psyche or the self. That's clearly a manifestation of the divine, right? But in a symbolic form. Okay, so it's what in the Upanishadic tradition would be called Saguna Brahman, or the divine with some attributes, however you've experienced it. It has some qualities. Jung, I don't think Jung really talks about Nirguna Brahman, the divine, which is absolute with no qualities. He's very interested in these kind of numinous religious experiences. So for me, the equivalence is that where they meet is in this notion of Saguna Brahman, the divine with qualities or with attributes.
Ishvara. Otherwise,
it's the same thing. Exactly.
Yes.
Ishvara.
So consciousness, along with these attributes, is how Jung would talk about the self.
I think so. Yeah. He would say, well, he says we don't know what it is in its nature. We can't say what it is, but we can say how it manifests itself in the form of these kind of experiences. And in moving the personality and producing dreams and probably synchronistic events and that kind of thing. But it doesn't have the absolute quality of Atman Brahman, when
right.
you look together. As far as I
there's,
know in the Upanishads, I may not have come across this, but I haven't seen anywhere where there's a discussion of these kind of numinous experiences that Jung writes about.
yeah, there's not, and that's what I was going to ask you about as well. I'm wondering about how you would. Well, it seems like what you're saying is that if so, for Jung, um, if we can say the Jungian self as Ishvara, so Ishvara
Yeah.
manifests in dreams and experiences,
Yeah.
and those are very important
Yeah.
for a person to grow and to be more comfortable with their personality.
And to become closer to the divine. I mean, this is a spiritual practice. The more you do this kind of work, the more you feel in touch with that. So it's an approach to that, capital T, that. It's an approach to that as it's a form of yoga. It's not self-inquiry and it's not meditation, but it is a form of yoga because you are connecting with the absolute as it manifests itself in these ways.
So these are almost unique ways of accessing Ishvara.
I think that's how I understand Jung. There's a kind of yoga for the West,
Yeah.
Have patience to sit still in there.
Right.
But I mean, you can do all this at the same time. These practices are not mutually exclusive.
Could you say a little more about what, like, of, because as you were saying that dreams are almost de-emphasized in Vedanta, they're seen as not very important. Why? What? I think you pointed this out already, but maybe we can just pull this apart a bit more about why dreams would be important for a Vedanta student.
Well, because Vedanta students have personalities and they have an unconscious, right? And why not get to know the deeper levels of yourself? When you talk about realizing the self, I mean, even Shankara says samadhi by itself isn't enough because you don't stay there. You may have that experience, with the grace of God, but you can't stay there. You couldn't drive a car in samadhi.
Right. It's a temporary experience.
So when you work with dreams and these other manifestations of the unconscious, that's the rest of your life. There's a whole lot more to you. I realize it doesn't have the depth of a samadhi experience. Yeah. It's not contact with the divine at that level. But you get a tremendous amount from doing that kind of work because when you work with dreams, you realize that the self is, in fact, Jung says that you realize that you are the object of a superordinate subject, capital S. You realize that the self is aware of you and that the dreams are tailored to your personality. And that's a remarkable experience, actually. It's kind of an individualized approach.
It's almost like Ishvara speaking to you.
Well, that's exactly how I would put it, directly and personally. Whereas a practice like meditation is fine for everybody, but the dream work is tailored just to the apparent individual. We will probably agree there are no individuals, but at that level, you know what I mean?
Yes.
The dream work seems to be tailored to the individual.
What would you say to someone who might say that, but my dreams are just, are just my own projections, my own, I guess they have no bearing on reality,
Well, the dreams are part of manifestation. Manifestation is all a manifestation of consciousness or Brahman, isn't it? So I don't understand why would that disqualify you paying attention to them? If I mean, you can say
Yeah.
they're projections of what? What does that mean?
I suppose, like, even thinking of, Shankara using the rope and snake example,
The rope and snake, yeah. Okay.
right? And seeing the rope as a snake. And so if I have knowledge of the rope, right, then I will no longer have this projection. So I'm not very interested in the projection per
Oh, I
se.
see. Oh, so don't pay attention to the snake when you can go straight to the rope. Is that?
Yes, exactly.
But sometimes you need to go through the snake to get. How do you realize that the snake is really a rope? Sometimes if you have to pay attention to the snake a little to really a rope.
Mhm.
It's a very good metaphor, that actually, isn't it? I mean, that's what we are doing. We're paying attention to the snake. But
Yeah.
then we will realize that there's something behind the snake is not ultimately real. It's a mirage.
Mhm,
A
mhm.
mirage in the desert. I mean, isn't this one of the meanings of Maya? A mirage in the desert exists, but it's not real. But you can't say it doesn't exist, right?
Mhm,
We're sort of, so a dream is like that. You can't say it doesn't exist,
right.
but it's not absolute reality. But it's like paying attention to any other manifestation.
Mhm, mhm. And so even that level of reality, we would call that pratibhasika in Vedanta. It's this projected reality or subjective reality.
Subject, yeah, subjective reality.
And so even that has something, like the snake has something to teach us, is what you're
Yeah,
trying to say.
but it has an objective aspect to it because it doesn't come out of the ego. So that's why
I
it calls
think
that
that's an important distinction.
psyche, the objective psyche.
Uh,
Like another consciousness. If you like, I'll just overstate it. You're having a conversation with God, who is producing these dreams as a way of talking to you to point out certain things about yourself that I've oversimplified it slightly.
Sure, that's helpful though.
But that's what's going on. Well, why not have that conversation? I mean, okay, if you want to say, well, I am that, but that's a very high level. Hardly any of us are at that level.
Sure. No, I think that's very important. Yeah, that it's interesting you saying it's not subjective, that even though that level of reality is objective in a way, it's created for a purpose.
Obviously a superior consciousness to the ego. So it's a very important dialogue.
Right. Which can be, I think, is missed in Hindu spirituality.
Well, it's missed in the traditional Eastern approaches. They didn't think that material was very important.
Yeah.
And maybe that worked in India, but it doesn't work in America because everybody's so neurotic.
Do you have any idea about why that might have worked in traditional India?
I can only guess that there was a more stable family system and people were less disturbed. But I don't know if that's true. I mean, that's just a pure guess.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, they must have had people who were anxious and depressed. The human condition. So in a way, we've evolved a practice for helping people with that, as well as realizing your true nature and so on. We have this, we can do this as well.
Well, it seems like also that psychotherapy can help the person. It almost can, help the person as we, I know we simplify this, but being comfortable with their self in some way so that they can enter into the philosophical aspect of Vedanta. and understanding the true self.
Yeah, well, you can do that even without psychotherapy. I mean, many people have done that. So
Right, right. Mm.
There's a little bit of a discussion in the literature about whether individuation is the same as realization,
Mm.
you know, in the Vedantic sense. I don't think they are the same, but can you get there from here without meditation and inquiry and so on? I don't know. I don't know.
What would the difference be?
Well, you may do all this personal work on your own unconscious and may have many experiences of the transpersonal unconscious, but may never have a realization of I am that.
Yeah, absolutely.
That may never come.
Mm.
Even when you've had that experience, I can't believe that that makes all your own little neurotic traits go away. It hasn't done in my case.
Right.
I mean, I don't know. Did Shankara have no neurotic difficulties of any kind? I don't know.
Sure.
Because nobody reports that kind of thing. You know, how would we know?
Right.
Think of somebody in the tradition, in the Vedantic tradition, with a very high level of attainment. And what was Ramana like as a personality? I mean, when you reach these very high levels of attainment, you don't lose your personality.
Sure. But I suppose they would say that, you know, through a life of values and living, you know, a devotional practice and karma yoga, that the personality becomes purified in that way. And so we wouldn't need this separate.
Yeah, I'm suspicious of that word purified. But I mean, I don't know. I don't mean to be skeptical about it, but
no, I'm loving it.
Well, maybe it's correct. I don't know. I guess I haven't met anybody at that level. My guess is that what would happen to people like that is that their personal material becomes less important, less painful, less demanding, and when anxiety and depression and so on arise, that they subside more quickly. You know, that's my guess.
Yeah, but I think by purify I meant like they would say your likes and dislikes for your raga dvesha decrease because now you're
yes, they don't they don't matter. It doesn't matter. I think Krishnamurti used to say it doesn't matter what happens, you know. It's all part of the way things unfold the way they should do.
Yeah, exactly.
If you could be at that level, then that's great. You don't need psychotherapy, but not many of us are there.
Right.
Yeah.
I wonder if we could just explore the other side of this of how might Vedanta be useful for someone who's studying psychotherapy or a psychotherapist?
Well, yes, that's a good question. I mean, it's very important to know that there is a divine ground. Of course, you can be an atheist. A lot of, probably a high proportion of psychotherapists are atheists. But so I don't quite know how to answer that. If you know that the personality has a divine ground and that you have a certain karmic endowment, that makes a difference to your attitude. But a lot of psychotherapists and psychiatrists and psychologists, they want their work to be a purely secular pursuit. They don't want it to have any kind of religious connotation. So it's one of the reasons that Jung is not popular in the mainstream of this field. He's too religious.
Yeah.
He's a Platonist. He's a two-world theorist. You know, there's the spiritual dimension and this dimension. And the academy, by and large, is Aristotelian. You know, it's all very down to earth and physicalist and so on.
So Jung and well, I guess a psychotherapist, you're saying it's very important to have the spiritual ground.
Well, I think so, but I'm just trying to say many people don't. I mean, it's not something that's taught in most mainstream schools of psychotherapy and psychology.
Right, right.
Sorry, my computer's making a noise.
That's
I mean, it's only a minority of training programs who teach this kind of psychology.
right. Because I suppose because you can't empirically prove that.
Well, I wouldn't say that you can empirically demonstrate the presence of numinous experience, of religious experience.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big part of Jung's psychology, and I mean, there are many books written on the subject.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that that level is empirically demonstrable by the way it manifests itself. You know, lots of people have road to Damascus or burning bush experiences. They may not talk about them, but they have them.
Right.
And Jung is one of the best approaches to those experiences.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But they're not, but as I say, they're not taught in mainstream training programs.
Right. So if you were communicating to someone who's in a mainstream, who practices mainstream psychotherapy and they're working with someone with the spiritual background, specifically Hindu spirituality or Vedanta, what's something that you would convey, like what would be important for them to know in working with someone with a spiritual background?
Well, there are certain manifestations of the psyche which are not explicable in terms of mainstream psychological theory. I mean, if you think of, say, just to use those experiences, Saul on the road to Damascus, hearing the voice of Jesus saying, "Why do you persecute me?"
Yeah, or I have a client who would talk to Krishna and Krishna would talk back.
Yeah, okay. So the question that the mainstream would raise in a situation like that is this person crazy? How do you distinguish whether he's having an authentic mystical experience of the holy or the sacred, or is he just, you know, psychotic or having an overheated imagination? Or in the case of St. Paul, a lot of people think he had temporal lobe epilepsy, which is known to produce religious experience.
Wow.
Well, you laugh, but it's a,
yeah.
It's a mainstream theory about him.
Wow.
So when you hear this kind of experience that Jung writes a lot about, Jung thinks these experiences are very healing. You will either approach it if you don't believe there is a spiritual dimension, you will approach it reductively. You know, you'll say, well, what were you smoking or something? Or it was hysterical or defensive or something like that. But if you accept that there's a spiritual dimension, then you take it at face value as an encounter with the transpersonal dimension. If you don't believe there is a transpersonal dimension, you're forced to approach it reductively. That's all. You have to look for some kind of what's called a naturalistic explanation,
right?
Not non-supernatural explanation.
Seems like you would lose a lot of empathy in that process.
Well, the patient or the client probably wouldn't tell a therapist if he or she thought that the therapist was not receptive. And sometimes when people have these kind of experiences, they check out the therapist a little bit to see, are you receptive to spiritual material? And if they get a dismissive response, they just don't talk about it, which is unfortunate, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've forgotten what other things you wanted to talk about. What else was there?
I think that answers a lot of the questions, because I think we came to them in some way or the other. I'm just looking at them 1 second. I guess my only last question would be if you can just talk a little bit about Jung's interest in Vedanta, or
Yeah,
in yeah.
I think he realizes that his notion of the self is the same as the Atman. It has to be. You have two different things, two different entities, right? But he's not, as I said before, he's not willing to develop a completely non-dual point of view.
Right.
So, although I heard that on his deathbed he was reading Zen. I don't know if that's true or not. Those apocryphal stories, it may not be true.
Yeah. So if there's not a non-dual perspective, is it like a part-whole relationship? Is that between the self and the ego?
Well, yeah. The ego, the self is for Jung would be this larger, much larger consciousness that we don't really, whose nature we don't understand, but it produces these kind of experiences that we can relate to, and in the process,
Sure.
we become more conscious of the self. That's his idea.
But the individual ego or individual consciousness is a part of that whole.
Well, it has to be, because he says that the self is the totality. So
Okay, right.
The ego cannot really be separate, but it feels separate. That's part of the whole problem. We feel separate.
Yeah.
And that's what realization is all about, when you realize that you're not separate. But Jung wouldn't go that far.
Okay. But he was aware of the Upanishad, the concept of Atman, and he was
aware of that. Yeah. Oh yeah. And he valued those traditions, but I think he thought that the West had to get had to get there in its own way. He didn't think that Westerners should use Eastern practices, which is kind of silly. They're perfectly good practices. I mean, and lots of Westerners have benefited from them, but that was his limitation, I think.
Well, thank you, Dr. Corbett. I think that this has been a wonderful conversation.
Pleasure. Okay.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Okay, take care.